So, next installment in ecology, one of our last, is going to be studying human populations. Now, we looked a little bit at just regular population trends. In human populations, scientists get to use these things known as population pyramids. What this is an overall graph of what age is everybody in Afghanistan in the year 2019. So, if you were to look and click on the link, you get this, but if you click on the link, you also get this chart. This chart is really nice. It shows you where the population was from 1950 up until today. And then this is if the trend were to continue in that country under those circumstances, it's going to grow to this rate in this year. It's just a nice projection. Obviously, it's not always going to be 100% accurate, but it's going to show you, okay, this is the trend that the population's taking. This is where we can project to see it. Now, the first country I chose was just Afghanistan. It has some pretty telling data here, so I thought it was a good place to start. If you were to look in Afghanistan, um, you could see over here in the blue, and this is true for all of these. These are all going to be the males, and these are all going to be the females. Males are going to be in blue, females are going to be in this reddish pink color. If you look next to each one, it tells you the age range of each bar. So these two bars correspond to people in Afghanistan 0 to 4 years old, 5 to 9, 10 to 14. Also, if you look, this is the percentage of the total population. What this says is 7.6 of all Afghani citizens are going to be males between the range of 0 and 4. 7.2% of all Afghanis are going to be females between the age of 0 and 4. Collectively, we're looking at almost 15% of the Afghani population being age 0 to 4. That's what this data is showing us right now. But there's a lot more here. If you were to look here at the top, we see that, well, there's a disproportionate amount of children in Afghanistan. And that's true. But you have to understand that that doesn't necessarily mean that these guys are dying off in droves. Sure, that could be the case. But you're not going to get a good indication of mortality rates just looking at this alone. There can be a lot of data here that can be said for mortality, but looking at this, you can't just say, wow, okay, so it must be that people are dying off after the age of 10. Sure, in some war-torn countries, that could be the case. Afghanistan does fall into that category. But more than likely, what we're seeing here is just a rapidly growing population. People are having kids and they're having lots of them. And when we see that, we know that that population is going to grow. That's further indicated by this graph. As you can see, over time, this population is going to skyrocket. Now, that's one data piece that you could pick out from a population pyramid. But I pulled up the second country, Belarus, and you may be familiar with them. Belarus is a country that we spoke about. It's where part of that Bialowieza forest is when we studied ecology at the beginning of the unit. Now, Belarus had a very interesting story, and I just kind of wanted to go into it to show you with these population pyramids what you can really learn. Here's the population pyramid of Belarus. Now, just so you know, it's right next to Moscow. Here's Lithuania. This is Poland. Here's the Ukraine down here. So Russia, Lithuania. This is, I think, Latvia, Poland, Ukraine. You get an idea of where this country is. This is a developed country. We're not talking about some small African country. This is a country that, although it's had quite a history, you'd expect to see a pretty stable population. However, this is the pyramid. Now, this pyramid tells quite a bit. First of all, if you were to look at the lower age group, we seem to see that there are fewer children than there are 30-year-olds. That could mean a few things. There was either a baby boom, like we've experienced in this country at that age, or people are having less children. And that could be the case. We don't know yet, and that's not really the most alarming piece. What's most alarming is this. If you were to look at people in Belarus, ages 45 to 49, we see that the population of males becomes drastically disproportionate to the population of females. Now, for instance, at the age of 65 to almost 70, we see way more females than males. And this tends to be true for all people in Belarus over the age of, why is this thing here? over the age of 45, right here. So I started thinking about it, and I was like, well, what the heck is happening in Belarus that would cause this kind of problem? And I actually spoke with Mr. Fusco about it because it was just such a weird pyramid that I, by chance, happened to pull up. So I did some investigating. And what I found is first that when Chernobyl happened, although it was in Ukraine, you could see there, it was right on the border of Belarus. Now, if you don't know, Chernobyl was this awful nuclear disaster. A bunch of fail-safes had happened, and it pretty much just nuked this entire city. Um, everything was it was awful. And what we see here in the red is going to be the zones that are completely uninhabitable. You can see that most of it happens to be in Belarus, even though the meltdown was in Chernobyl. Now, because of the rivers and the flow of energy or flow of water and things like that, we see that there was actually a lot of fallout on the easternmost side of Belarus as well. Sure, there's damage done in Russia, there's damage done in the Ukraine, but it seems like Belarus took the brunt of the damage. So that was the first thing I thought. So I looked into it, and about 70% of nuclear radioactive fallout from Chernobyl was in Belarus. Belarus. It affected 7 million people. And I was like, oh, done deal. You know, the men are going to be the people working in the nuclear power plant. The men are going to be the farmers that are affected by this. They're going to be the people working those jobs. And what we see is that fallout from the nuclear disaster that pretty much targets that group. Now, this happened April 26, 1986. And that would be about 34 years ago, almost to the day. You look at this and you think 34 years ago, okay, you know, maybe these kids started working at the age of like 14, 15. That starts to explain this. Now, I was talking to Mr. Fusco about it, and he didn't really buy it. So he ended up doing a little more research. And through more digging, we found even more evidence. On this article, why do men die so early in Belarus? Now, this is one of many tales as to why this population is so off the charts. In Belarus, the average person drinks 17.5 liters of alcohol per year, whereas the world average is going to be 6.2. So you're already looking at, you know, these people drinking 3 times the limit. However, males consume even more than the average. Males are going to be consuming 4.5 times the amount of alcohol that the average person in the world consumes. So heavy drinking, especially targeting males, that's going to be a problem. They say that almost 4% of the population is going to be considered an alcoholic. And because it's so underreported, you could double or triple that statistic, meaning that up to 12% of Belarus is going to be alcoholics. Because it targets males, you can see that this is going to be a big problem. But it went on to say even more. Smokers, most of the smokers in Belarus are going to be males. That's going to reduce the life expectancy. And it also said that habitual smokers really, and this was in another article, start at like the age of 11 to 13. So you could see that smoking in that culture is going to reduce the life expectancy of males as well, especially compounding with alcohol addiction. And that's not just it. Men also in Belarus tend to avoid doctors and medical attention because they're smoking, because they're drinking, and because they're not going to doctors. This becomes even worse. Furthermore, the Ministry of Labor prohibits women from working dangerous jobs. So most of those dangerous jobs are going to be worked by the males in those countries. And then this is staggering. If you look at suicide rates in Belarus, 80% of them are going to be committed by males compared to females. So we're looking at a high suicide rate. We're looking at dangerous jobs for men and not women. We're looking at high rates of alcohol addiction and a lot of smoking addiction. And all of those play into what creates this very disproportionate number of females versus males in the population. So that was kind of a cool thing, you know, just looking at this graph, once you start to understand it, you'll see that something weird is going on here. And then with a little research, you can figure out exactly why. There's a lot of data to be had just looking at these graphs. That's just one story. And the second piece is going to be looking at these demographic transitions. And what these demographic transitions do is it shows you just kind of what state the country's in. I pulled up Afghanistan first, and even if you've never even seen a picture of Afghanistan, you've heard about it in the news. There's a lot of war there. It's definitely not something you'd necessarily go to vacation at. So it's going to be way different than, say, the quality of life in Belarus or the United States or Canada or Japan or China. Now, these demographic transitions show you the stages that a population is in as it becomes more modernized. Now, technology does play a big role in this, and you'll see why in a second. It's not always going to be the case, but we see that a combination of technology, developed government, and things like that, we see that these populations start to stabilize through a fairly predictable pattern. Now, the first stage of these demographic transitions are going to be pretty much obsolete at this point. Think like cavemen. When cavemen first existed, they were giving birth to tons and tons of babies at once. I mean, maybe over the course of their life, you're talking like maybe 10 to 12 children. However, the death rate was really high. There was no medicine. There was like saber-toothed tigers and whatever attacking these guys. It was high birth rate and high death rate. Overall, the total population was still very low because although they had a lot of kids, a lot of them were dying. Now, we could still see this in some very primitive cultures, but by and large, we're not really looking at this model anymore. Over time, though, what we see is these populations get better at survival. And when they get better at survival, the death rate or the mortality rate decreases, but the birth rate stays the same. Now, because you have a lower mortality rate and a constant birth rate, what we see is that high birth rate raises the population quite a bit. Now, this is stage 2. In a stage 2 population, you're going to see that it has a very high birth rate. The mortality rate is on the decrease, and the population is overall rising as a trend. So if you look at a demographic chart and you're like, whoa, this population seems to be getting bigger. There's a lot of kids here, and these kids don't seem to be dropping off. You're in a stage 2 model. Now, in stage 3, what we start to see is because that mortality rate has dropped and the population's gotten bigger, people tend to have less children. Think of, they start to get better paying jobs. And if they get a better paying job, they're maybe not going to want to have as many kids. We're now looking at a more modernized culture where, you could take a vacation or have 10 children. You got to think that in a time where you pretty much rely on yourself, it's advantageous to have as many kids as you can because that's a lot of help. We're now looking at a time where in stage 3, having kids becomes maybe more of a financial burden, so people have less. Also, there's less need because the mortality rate is low and the population's pretty good. So what we see is a steady growing population, but a lowering birth rate over the years. This looks like, maybe almost like an upside down pyramid. Not fully, but where we see that the ages 0 to 4 are going to be a little less than the ones before them. And what we see is, a bulge in a population and then a gradual decrease. That's going to tell you you're at stage 3, where we see that the population is going to be growing, but it's not going to be growing. It's still going to be growing pretty fast, but the birth rate's going to be decreasing over time. And when we get to stage 4, we now have a constant mortality rate. Now we have medicine, we've got agriculture, we've got all these things that allow us to live a good, fulfilled life that ultimately aren't going to take our lives too soon. We have a very high population that's starting to stabilize, and as a result, people are just having less children. This is going to be, you have a family of 2 people, they on average have 2 kids. You're pretty much going to be replacing yourself in that population. Overall, the population growth is going to be very slow. And this is going to represent more of like a column than a pyramid. Think just all the way up. Everyone's pretty much surviving throughout. We're not trying to have tons and tons of children, and the population's fairly stable. Now, the 5th stage is something that's very new age. It's been proposed. We don't exactly know, and you can see why it's still a question mark because we're just starting to see this trend. But in stage 5, and like I said, very remote circumstances, there are a few countries that see this. Birth rate actually gets a lot. Oops, I didn't change these words, but whatever. The birth rate is actually going to go below the mortality rate. When the birth rate goes below the mortality rate, we see a declining population, but it's still with those things that were afforded in modernization, medicine, agriculture, you know, education, refrigeration, all of these things. And it's kind of weird to figure out exactly what's going on here. But a lot of people think, you just become married to your job. You've you've got all these other luxuries in life. You may not need fulfillment through children. Having children no longer becomes something of helping around the house or replacing you. Now it becomes almost a financial burden. And like I said, we could see this in some populations where actually the birth rate's decreasing, the mortality staying the same, and that population's declining. Think of a very modern population, a modernized country. If you see a decline in population, they're probably in stage 5. Now, those are the 5 stages of demographic transitions. I hope this helps. If you have any questions, please contact me. Those are the 5 stages. Sorry about this note. Enjoy. Like I said, contact me with any questions. Thanks.